Welcome to Canopy Podcast, where we discuss how movies break down and defy societal norms through their characters. I'm your host, Ben Cantor, and today we will be talking about one of arguably the greatest superheroes of all time, Spider-Man. The social norm we will be discussing is the juxtaposition between Spider-Man and the traditional stereotypical American superhero. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. There have been many variants of Spider-Man through the last two decades, played by different actors. We will be addressing a few of these films. However, the main focus is going to be on the 2002 original Spider-Man. For those who have not seen the film, here's a quick little summary. The movie follows Peter Parker, a very intelligent but nerdy high school senior who is bullied, doesn't have a lot of friends, and is secretly in love with the girl next door, Mary Jane. But he's too awkward and shy to act on those feelings. And he was also orphaned as a child and now lives with his aunt and uncle. All in all, Peter has had it pretty rough. But one day, on a school field trip to a research laboratory, Peter Parker, played by Tobey Maguire, is bitten by a genetically engineered radioactive super spider that gives him the same enhanced abilities that it has. Super strength, speed, and agility, plus the ability to stick to walls and shoot webs from his wrists, not to mention a sixth sense called the Spidey sense. Once he discovers these powers and witnesses the death of his Uncle Ben, he decides to put his new powers to use to rid the city of evil, being a high schooler by day and your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man at night. However, Peter quickly learns that with great power comes great responsibility. Scientist Norman Osborn, who just so happens to also be the father of Peter's best friend, Harry Osborn, is under pressure from the government to produce a superhuman enhancing formula. With time running out, Osborn dares to test the serum on himself, driving him mad and doubling his personality, creating his alter ego, the Green Goblin, who seeks to rain terror over the city. Peter must stop the Green Goblin at all costs and try to keep those he loves out of harm's way. So yeah, that's the first release of Spider-Man, the birth of one of the greatest superheroes of all time. But when we think of the stereotypical superhero, Spider-Man is not necessarily what comes to mind. So let's talk about how we perceive the traditional Hollywood superhero. When we think of traditional classic American superheroes, the textbook examples would be characters such as Superman, Batman, Captain America, Thor, etc. They all have one main thing in common. They fit the societal expectation of masculinity perfectly. They have huge muscles, biceps bigger than their heads, deep voices, very masculine traits and actions, and they hide their problems and insecurities from the world. When we think of superheroes, these are the attributes that more often than not come to mind. In an article from the University of Leicester, the author explains that, quote, these behaviors have mainly been regarded as quintessentially masculine with regards to the ways in which the superheroes act in the time. Since the 1980s, Western audiences have become obsessed with hypermasculinity, especially regarding how artists represent this hypermasculinity in images of the male body, end quote. The author helps to reinforce the point we are making now. The American audience has become fascinated with and obsessed by the hyper-masculine characters of the traditional superhero. Let's even take Iron Man, for example. A man in an iron suit probably doesn't need to fit this description, yet even his iron suit has chiseled six-pack abs and toned biceps. But when we look at Spider-Man, these are not the traits we see. He is strong, don't get me wrong, but he's not strong in the same way that many of these superheroes are. He's toned, but he's not built like Thor or Cap. And we get to see all of his personal issues that make him who he is. The loss of his parents and living with his aunt and uncle, the intense bullying he faces in high school as seen primarily through the character Flash Thompson, and his lack of friends since we really only see him having two throughout the movie, MJ and Harry. All of these aspects come together to make the audience realize that at the end of the day, he's still human, and he's just a high school kid with high school kid problems. Let's talk more about that. He's just a high schooler. He's going through puberty, high school, and everything that comes with both of those milestones. An uneasy time for any kid, much less one with the responsibilities that have fallen upon him with these newly found powers. We see this struggle of balance a lot in the sequel film, Spider-Man 2, released in 2004, where Peter struggles greatly with balancing school, work, and saving the city. And he actually decides to hang up the suit for a little while. Aunt May even has a hysterical line where she's telling Peter to get some rest and says, "You're not Superman, you know," which ironically is the exact point we are making here. But speaking of responsibilities, Uncle Ben's iconic line from this movie, "With great power comes great responsibility," is so important. It's unfair that Peter, at such a young age, was given these powers. He most certainly questions whether these powers are a blessing or a curse. He's just a high school kid and should not and should be able to simply do high school kid things like go to a party, hang out with his friends, regardless of how few there are. He should not have to stop a train moving over 100 miles per hour, or save countless people from a burning building, or fight literal supervillains threatening to torment the city. Understandably, Peter doesn't really want these responsibilities. He just wants to be young and live his life. But his moral compass is so strong that he hears what Uncle Ben has to say and recognizes that if you have the power to do something, make sure you do it for the good of others. In the book, A Comics Studies Reader, author Peter Coogan explains what defines a superhero and all the different attributes that make a hero. While talking about identity, he states that, quote, the identity convention most clearly marks the superhero as different, end quote. What makes the heroes seem different is that they don't have the same problems like you and I have. They have to fight aliens and supervillains. While, my biggest struggle I've had to face recently was that e-contest I had last week. But with Spider-Man, we get to see him go through many of the same daily struggles we go through. We see him get bullied in the hallways. We see him actually pay for his food, and we see him put his pants on one leg at a time, just like us. All of these aspects humanize him in a way that other heroes simply don't have, since all we see with these other heroes is a manly man who has no personal problems. Spider-Man yet again breaks the Hollywood norm and sets a better example for the young audience members by defying the myth that in order to be masculine, you have to have all these traits that these hyper-masculine superheroes have. While I was doing my research for this podcast, I found myself asking the question, how was Spider-Man created? A superhero that defies all societal norms, and does it in 1962, when the first comic book edition of Spider-Man was first released. A time where the importance of hypermasculinity was really, really high. All writers at the time had to be thinking narrowly about how superheroes would play and sell in the comics. Big muscles, masculine traits, chiseled jawline, deep voices, confident, all of the societal expectations of men. So how would a high school kid without any of these crazy muscles and with actual personal problems sell comics or in the box office? And who would be bold enough to take on such a task? Of course, none other than my man, the man himself, Stan Lee. Rest in peace. Who also made his first cameo in this film, which, if you're a big Marvel fan like me, you'll know that he makes the most amazing cameos in all of the movies based on the comics that he's written. This question led me down a fascinating rabbit hole with how Stan Lee created Spider-Man. I found an interview Stan Lee did where he explains the amazing story of how he created Spider-Man. Lee explains how the first step in creating a superhero is coming up with a superpower. As he asked himself the question, what power will I give my next hero? He saw a little fly crawling on a wall and said to himself, man, if I could have a superhero that could stick and climb to walls, that would be so cool. So boom, he's got his power. Next, he needed a name. Mosquito Man? No, come on. Fly Man? Really? That's just lame. Then he stumbled upon Spider-Man. It just sounded dramatic. So boom, he's got the power, he has the name, and then he decides just for fun, he's going to give the character deep personal problems. He's going to make him a teenager, since there were no teenage superheroes at the time. So Lee's thrilled with this idea, runs to the publisher, and the publisher says, this might be the worst idea I've ever heard. People hate spiders. He can't be called Spider-Man. And a teenager? Teenagers can only be sidekicks, not heroes. And personal problems? Don't you know what a superhero is? The whole point is that their lives seem picturesque. So the idea was killed, and Spider-Man with it. But they were about to kill the magazine, and apparently when you're about to kill a magazine, no one really cares what you put in the last issue. So to get it out of his system, Lee threw Spider-Man, an amazing fantasy, in the issue. Copies flew off the shelves and sold out unbelievably fast, and thus Spider-Man was born. Against all odds, the amazing Spider-Man prevailed, and became one of the most popular heroes of all time. In the book, Superheroes, A Modern Mythology, author Richard Reynolds brings up a fascinating point of discussion with the political climate of the nation at the time of the creation of superheroes. Reynolds explains that, quote, America's entry into World War II gave the superheroes a whole new set of enemies and supplied a complete working rationale and worldview for a super patriotic superhero such as Captain America, end quote. With the entry into the war, and the entire nation being unified behind its soldiers. This made for the perfect opportunity to create this hyper-masculine super soldier, the ideal man of the time period. This makes Spider-Man's fame even more impressive. Not 20 years after the end of World War II, the first issue of Spider-Man was printed and flew off the shelves like I mentioned earlier, despite the societal norm of the time. Tying it back to the original film, Spider-Man was a milestone for the film industry, as it made hard-to-visualize powers pop off the screen and engage the audience just like any other hero. Let's take Superman as an example. His powers are easy to make exciting and engaging. He can fly, easy enough. That's just super cool. He can shoot lasers out of his eyes and freeze things with his breath. Again, so cool. And easy to visualize. You can have lots of explosions and such using these powers. But for Spider-Man, he swings from a web and sticks to walls. How are you supposed to make a 2-hour movie stay engaging and exciting the entire time with just that? Well, they did. These films all used amazing CGI to show Spider-Man swinging from building to building, doing crazy flips and stunts all the way throughout. The way the directors did this was amazing and made Spider-Man one of the most fun characters to watch on the screen. Again, showing that anything is possible and that the character does not need to fit the stereotypical Hollywood hero to perform well. Spider-Man also does not interact with other characters from the film in the same way that these more traditional superheroes do. In an article I found about Spider-Man, Spider-Man makes different cinematic choices than other superheroes. The first interesting noticeable difference is how Spider-Man interacts with villains. Unlike many other superheroes, most of the time his goal is not to kill the villain. Although, to be honest, unfortunately they often do end up dead, but that was never the goal in mind. Like, let's take Spider-Man 2 for an example. While Doc Ock ends up dead, it's not at the hands of Spider-Man, but rather his own doing. Similar, in the first film, Spider-Man does not purposefully kill the Green Goblin, but in an attempt to kill Spider-Man, the Green Goblin kills himself. Spider-Man takes the route of justice, if you will. Many other superheroes have no remorse in killing their nemesis, and anyone who stands in their way. In fact, often this is the goal. In addition, his villains are often actually of Earth, and are human. He's known as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, taking down bank robbers and petty thieves, as well as, of course, the occasional mad scientist whose experiment goes horribly wrong and then plagues the city. Rather than otherworldly villains. This is a fascinating juxtaposition that there have been many speculations as to why this is the chosen dynamic. I choose to believe that it's because, at first, he doesn't really want these powers or responsibilities that come with them. Like we've talked about, at the end of the day, he's just a kid who, like the rest of us, would never want that responsibility on our shoulders. Another stark difference is the way in which he acts around MJ. He is unbelievably awkward around her. Their dialogue is that of a stereotypical nerd talking to the popular girl, whereas, like Iron Man, for example, he's known as the Playboy ladies' man. Peter has a line to MJ where he's trying to ask her out and stutters and says, "Let's go get lunch some evening." This is another example of a broken societal expectation. It would be much more masculine of him to be a very smooth talker and have, the ability to spit mad game. Instead, he struggles a lot with social interactions in general, going back to the fact that he's definitely a nerd and a dork, but that's what makes him so unique and so special. So let's do a brief comparison to other Spider-Man films. While we see changes to the character in all of the different renditions of Spider-Man, these traits all remain the same. In the original films, the web shooters are organic. They come right out of Peter, whereas in the new films starring Tom Holland, the web shooters are mechanical and designed by Peter, showing further the extent of his intellect. There are slight fundamental changes like these in all three versions of the character, but in all variants, he's still just a high school student battling with his own issues, trying to best deal with the responsibilities he has been dealt, and doing a damn good job, if you ask me. Pardon my language. All summed up, I hope I've been able to show you at least a little bit of how Spider-Man breaks the mold of toxic masculinity within mainstream traditional superheroes and has paved the way for a new generation of heroes to come. On that note, that's all I've got for today's podcast. I think it might just be pizza time. And if you get that reference, you're truly as big of a Spider-Man fan as I am. And to be honest, we pros probably need some help. Links to the sources quoted and referenced can be found below if you wish to give those a deeper look. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this episode of Can It Be Podcast. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. I hope to see you next week. Peace out.